There is a kind of person who walks through life feeling everything just a little deeper than everyone else, and yet for the longest time it never feels like a strength. It feels like a quiet burden they were never taught how to carry. They notice things others ignore: the tension in a room before a single word is spoken, the sadness behind a forced smile, the shift in someone's tone that nobody else picks up on. And while the world moves forward without stopping, they are left trying to process waves of emotions that don't even belong to them. In the beginning, there is no understanding of what this is. There is only the feeling of being too much in a world that seems to reward those who feel less. So they learn, slowly and silently, to question themselves. Why do I feel this way? Why can't I just be like everyone else? And without realizing it, the very thing that will one day become their greatest power begins as the reason they feel most out of place. As life unfolds, this sensitivity doesn't fade. It intensifies. Every environment becomes something they absorb rather than just experience. A loud household, unspoken conflicts, emotional distance, even subtle disappointments, all of it settles inside them like weight they were never meant to carry. They don't just witness emotions, they internalize them. And because no one explains this to them, they begin to believe it's their responsibility to fix what they feel. If someone is upset, they must be the one to make it better. If something feels wrong, they must be the one to adjust. This is where the quiet conditioning begins. Not through words, but through patterns. They become the listener, the peacemaker, the one who understands, even when no one understands them. And while others learn how to express themselves freely, they learn how to hold everything in, because their emotional world is already too full. At this stage, sensitivity doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like a curse. It creates confusion. It creates anxiety. It creates a constant state of emotional overload that they don't have the language to explain. They may find themselves overthinking simple interactions, replaying conversations, feeling responsible for things that were never theirs to carry. And when they try to express it, they are often misunderstood or dismissed. Told they are overreacting, told they are too sensitive, so they stop explaining. They stop sharing. They begin to adapt. And adaptation for them doesn't mean becoming stronger, it means becoming smaller. They start filtering themselves, softening their reactions, hiding their intensity, not because it's natural, but because it feels necessary for survival. The world didn't ask them to shrink directly, but it rewarded them when they did. So they learn how to stay small in ways that are almost invisible. They hold back their opinions to avoid conflict. They suppress their emotions to avoid being labeled dramatic. They give more than they receive because it feels safer than asking for anything in return. And over time, this becomes their identity. Not the sensitive one, but the easy one, the understanding one, the one who never causes problems. But beneath that calm surface, something else is happening. A slow disconnection from themselves. Because every time they ignore their own needs to prioritize someone else's comfort, they move further away from who they truly are. And the most dangerous part is, it doesn't feel wrong at first. It feels like kindness. It feels like love. It feels like being a good person. But in reality, it's the beginning of self-abandonment. And this is where a pattern quietly forms. One that shapes their relationships in ways they don't immediately understand. Because when someone is constantly giving, constantly understanding, constantly making space for others, they unintentionally attract people who take advantage of that space. Not always in obvious ways, but in subtle, draining ones. They find themselves surrounded by individuals who need a lot but give very little. People who lean on them emotionally but disappear when it's time to reciprocate. People who are drawn to their light but secretly depend on it without ever nurturing it. And because the empath has been conditioned to prioritize others, they don't recognize the imbalance right away. They see potential, they see pain, they see reasons to stay, to help, to fix. They convince themselves that if they just give a little more, understand a little deeper, love a little harder, things will change. But they don't. Instead, the cycle repeats, over and over again. Different faces, same pattern, and each time, something inside them gets a little more exhausted, a little more confused. Because no matter how much they give, it never seems to be enough to create the connection they are searching for. And this is where the emotional weight becomes unbearable. Not because they are weak, but because they have been strong in the wrong direction for too long. They have been pouring into others without ever being poured into themselves. They have been holding space for everyone else's emotions while neglecting their own. And eventually, that imbalance demands attention. What makes this phase so difficult is that they don't immediately blame others. They blame themselves. They wonder what they're doing wrong, why their relationships feel one-sided, why they keep ending up in the same emotional situations. They start to question their worth, their value, even their identity. Because when you've spent your entire life being the one who understands everyone else, it's hard to understand why no one seems to truly understand you. And this internal conflict creates a quiet kind of pain, the kind that isn't loud or dramatic, but constant and lingering. It follows them into their thoughts, into their decisions, into their sense of self. And yet, beneath all of this, something is slowly building, something they don't fully recognize yet. Every experience, every disappointment, every moment of emotional overwhelm, it's shaping them. Not in a way that breaks them, but in a way that prepares them. Because what they don't realize in these early stages is that their sensitivity is not the problem. It's the lack of boundaries, the lack of awareness, and the lack of understanding of their own power. They haven't learned how to use their empathy yet. They've only experienced what happens when it's uncontrolled, unprotected, and unbalanced. So they continue forward, carrying both their gift and their burden, unaware that one day those two things will separate. That one day, what once made them feel weak will become the very thing that makes them strong. That one day, they won't just feel everything, they will understand it, control it, and choose where to place it. But that version of them doesn't exist yet. Right now, they are still in the phase where empathy feels like something happening to them, rather than something they can direct. And that's the hidden truth about why their power comes later in life. Because before they can step into strength, they have to go through a phase where they feel everything without protection. Before they can recognize manipulation, they have to experience it. Before they can build boundaries, they have to know what it feels like to live without them. It's not a flaw in their journey, it's the foundation of it. Every moment of confusion, every time they felt too sensitive, every relationship that drained them, it was all shaping a level of awareness that cannot be taught, only lived. So while the world may see them as someone who takes longer to find their strength, the truth is they are building something deeper, something more powerful than surface-level confidence. They are developing emotional depth, perception, and resilience that only comes from experience. And even though it doesn't feel like it right now, even though it feels like they are falling behind while everyone else seems to move ahead, they are actually preparing for a kind of growth that most people will never reach. Because one day, everything they once struggled with will begin to make sense. And when that moment comes, it won't just change how they see others. It will completely transform how they see themselves. And when that moment finally begins to unfold, it doesn't arrive like a sudden burst of clarity or a dramatic turning point that changes everything overnight. It starts quietly, almost unnoticeably, like a subtle shift in awareness that feels unfamiliar at first. The same situations that once felt normal begin to feel heavy. The same people they once tolerated begin to feel draining. Conversations that used to be easy now feel forced, like something inside them is no longer willing to pretend. It's confusing, because nothing on the outside has changed, but everything on the inside has. There's a growing discomfort they can't ignore anymore, a quiet voice that keeps asking questions they once avoided. Why does this feel so one-sided? Why do I always feel exhausted after giving? Why am I the one constantly adjusting while others remain the same? This is the beginning of awakening, and it doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels unsettling. Because awareness doesn't just bring clarity, it also brings the painful realization of how much has been overlooked. With this awareness comes something even more difficult: the ability to finally see people clearly. Not through the lens of potential, not through the hope of who they could be, but through the reality of who they consistently show themselves to be. Patterns that once went unnoticed become impossible to ignore. The empty promises, the emotional inconsistency, the subtle manipulation hidden beneath charm or vulnerability, it all becomes visible. And this is where the internal conflict deepens, because now they are faced with a truth they can't unsee. The people they once gave everything to may not have been capable of giving the same in return. Not because the empath wasn't enough, but because those people were never meant to meet them at that depth. And accepting that truth is painful. It forces them to let go of the illusion that things could have been different if they had just tried harder. It confronts them with the reality that some connections were never meant to be healed. They were meant to be outgrown. Letting go, however, is not as simple as recognizing the problem. For someone who has spent their entire life holding on, understanding others, and trying to fix what feels broken, walking away feels unnatural. It feels wrong, even when it's right. There's guilt attached to it, doubt, second-guessing. They wonder if they're being too harsh, too distant, too different from who they used to be. Because for so long their identity was built around being the one who stayed, the one who endured, the one who never gave up on people. So choosing to let go feels like losing a part of themselves. But what they don't realize yet is that they're not losing themselves, they're finally choosing themselves. And that choice, as painful as it is, marks one of the most important turning points in their entire journey. As they begin to distance themselves from what no longer aligns, something unexpected happens. There is space, silence, and at first that silence feels uncomfortable, almost empty, because they've spent so much of their life filled with other people's emotions, other people's needs, other people's presence, that being alone with themselves feels unfamiliar. But within that silence, something begins to reemerge, a voice that was once drowned out, their own. It starts small, like a whisper of forgotten thoughts, desires, and feelings that were pushed aside for years. What do I actually want? What do I actually feel? What matters to me when no one else is influencing my decisions? These questions don't have immediate answers, but they begin to guide a process of rediscovery that is both healing and challenging. This phase is not about becoming someone new, it's about remembering who they were before they started shrinking, before they learned to prioritize everyone else, before they convinced themselves that their needs were less important. And as they reconnect with that part of themselves, they begin to realize something powerful. Their sensitivity was never the problem. It was the way they were taught to use it. They were taught to give it away, to suppress it, to let it be shaped by others, but they were never taught how to protect it. And that realization leads to one of the most transformative skills they will ever develop, the ability to set boundaries. At first, boundaries feel uncomfortable, almost unnatural. Saying no feels heavy. Speaking up feels risky. There's a fear that people will leave, that they will be seen differently, that they will lose the connections they've always held on to. And in some cases, that fear becomes reality. Some people do pull away, some relationships do fade. But instead of seeing this as loss, something deeper begins to shift in their understanding. They start to see boundaries not as rejection, but as clarity. Not as pushing people away, but as defining what is allowed to stay. And slowly they begin to realize that the people who truly value them will not be threatened by their boundaries. They will respect them. With each boundary set, something inside them strengthens. A sense of self that was once fragile becomes more grounded. They no longer feel the need to explain every decision, justify every feeling, or carry the emotional weight of others. They begin to understand that they are not responsible for how others react to their truth. And that understanding changes everything, because for the first time, their empathy is no longer being used against them. It is being guided by them. They still feel deeply, they still care, they still understand, but now there is a filter, a choice, a line that protects their energy instead of draining it. And as this transformation continues, their emotional intelligence begins to evolve into something far more powerful than they ever imagined. What once felt like overwhelming sensitivity now becomes sharp awareness. They can read between the lines of conversations, they can sense intentions without needing proof, they can feel the difference between genuine connection and hidden agendas. And the most important part is, they trust it. They no longer ignore their instincts to keep the peace. They no longer silence their inner voice to maintain comfort. Instead, they listen. And that ability to listen to themselves becomes one of their greatest strengths. This is the stage where manipulation begins to lose its power over them. Not because people stop trying, but because they can finally see it for what it is. Guilt no longer works the way it used to. Emotional pressure no longer controls their decisions. They recognize when someone is trying to take more than they are willing to give, and instead of adjusting themselves to accommodate it, they step back. They observe, they choose differently. And that shift, though subtle on the outside, is massive on the inside. Because for the first time, they are no longer reacting out of habit. They are responding with awareness. And with that awareness comes a new preference, one that may feel surprising even to them. They begin to choose solitude, not out of loneliness, but out of peace. The chaos that once felt familiar now feels exhausting. The noise, the drama, the constant emotional exchange, it no longer holds the same appeal. Instead, they find comfort in stillness, in quiet moments where they can think clearly, feel deeply without interference, and exist without the pressure to constantly give. And this choice is often misunderstood by others. It may be seen as distance, as withdrawal, as change, but in reality, it is alignment. It is the result of someone who has finally learned the difference between being alone and being at peace. And this is where their power truly begins to take shape, not in loud declarations or external validation, but in the quiet confidence of knowing who they are and what they will no longer tolerate. They are no longer searching for connection in places that require them to lose themselves. They are no longer chasing understanding from people who were never willing to give it. Instead, they are standing in a space that feels unfamiliar but right. A space where they are not just existing for others, but finally living for themselves. What once felt like a long period of struggle now begins to reveal its purpose. Every moment of confusion, every experience of being drained, every time they felt like they didn't belong, it was all leading to this. Not to break them, but to build them into someone who understands emotional depth in a way that most people never will. Someone who can navigate relationships with clarity instead of confusion. Someone who can give without losing themselves. Someone who can feel deeply without being controlled by it. And while this transformation doesn't erase the past, it changes how they carry it. It turns pain into awareness. It turns sensitivity into strength. It turns what once felt like a weakness into a quiet, undeniable power that continues to grow stronger with time. And as this quiet strength settles in, something even deeper begins to unfold within them. Something that goes beyond awareness, beyond boundaries, beyond simply protecting their energy. It becomes a process of healing that is no longer focused on others, but finally directed inward. For most of their life, they understood everyone else's emotions with remarkable clarity, but their own inner world remained unexplored, almost unfamiliar. Now, for the first time, they begin to sit with it, not to fix it quickly, not to escape it, but to truly understand it. The emotions they once suppressed begin to rise to the surface. Old wounds, unresolved pain, memories that still carry weight. And instead of pushing them away, they allow themselves to feel them fully. This is not an easy phase. It requires patience, honesty, and a willingness to face parts of themselves they once avoided. But within this process, something powerful begins to happen. The same depth that once overwhelmed them now becomes the very tool that helps them heal. They start to recognize patterns not just in others, but within themselves. They begin to understand why they stayed too long, why they gave too much, why they struggled to walk away. And with that understanding comes compassion, not for others this time, but for themselves. As they continue this inner work, the way they see their past begins to change. What once felt like a series of painful mistakes now starts to look like necessary lessons. They realize they were never weak for caring too much. They were simply unaware of how to direct that care. They were never foolish for believing in people. They were simply seeing the good before recognizing the truth. And this shift in perspective is transformative, because it removes the weight of self-blame that they carried for so long. Instead of seeing themselves as someone who was taken advantage of, they begin to see themselves as someone who was learning, evolving, and growing through experiences that shape their awareness. And with that realization, something inside them softens. Not in a way that makes them vulnerable again, but in a way that allows them to release the resentment, the guilt, and the confusion they once held onto. And as they heal, their energy begins to change in ways that are almost unexplainable, but deeply noticeable. They no longer seek validation in the same way. They no longer feel the need to prove their worth through how much they can give. There is a quiet confidence that starts to replace the constant questioning they once lived with. And this confidence doesn't come from external achievements or recognition. It comes from alignment, from knowing who they are, what they value, and what they deserve. It's subtle, but powerful. It shows in the way they carry themselves, in the way they respond instead of react, in the way they choose where to invest their time and energy. And this shift begins to influence the kind of people they attract into their life. Because once they stop overextending themselves, once they stop chasing connection in places that drain them, something changes in the dynamic of their relationships. They begin to attract individuals who are more aligned with their energy, people who don't require them to shrink, people who don't rely on them to carry everything, people who meet them with the same level of respect and understanding they naturally give. And at first, this can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because they are used to imbalance. They are used to giving more than they receive. So when something mutual, something healthy begins to appear, it almost feels too easy, too calm. But over time, they begin to recognize that this is what connection was always supposed to feel like. Not draining, not confusing, not one-sided, but balanced and genuine. And within these healthier connections, they begin to experience something they may have thought was out of reach. A sense of being truly seen, not just for what they can offer, but for who they are. Their depth is no longer something that intimidates or overwhelms others. It is something that is appreciated, respected, and valued. And this reinforces everything they've been learning about themselves, that they were never too much, they were simply in the wrong environments, that their sensitivity was never a flaw, it was a strength that needed the right space to exist. And as this realization settles in, it strengthens their sense of self even further. At the same time, their relationship with themselves continues to deepen. They no longer ignore their needs or dismiss their feelings. They listen to themselves with the same attention they once gave to everyone else. They create space for rest without guilt. They honor their emotions without judgment. And this self-connection becomes the foundation of everything else in their life. Because when you truly understand yourself, when you trust your instincts, when you respect your own boundaries, you no longer depend on others to define your worth. You no longer seek constant reassurance or external validation. You become grounded in a way that is unshakable, even when life around you feels uncertain. And this is where their presence begins to change in a way that others can feel, even if they can't explain it. There is a calmness to them, a steadiness. They are no longer easily pulled into emotional chaos or unnecessary drama. They observe more, react less. They speak with intention instead of impulse. And this creates a kind of quiet authority, one that doesn't demand attention, but naturally commands respect. People begin to notice that they are different, not in a loud or obvious way, but in a way that feels grounded and real. And this difference is not something they try to project, it is simply the result of everything they have gone through and everything they have learned. This quiet confidence continues to grow as they move forward in life. They no longer feel the need to explain themselves to everyone. They no longer feel pressured to fit into spaces that don't align with who they are. They are comfortable walking away from anything that disrupts their peace, even if it means standing alone for a while. And that is one of the most powerful shifts of all, no longer fearing solitude, because they have learned that being alone is not the same as being empty. In fact, for them, it is often where they feel the most full, the most connected, the most at peace. And as time goes on, everything they once struggled with begins to transform into something that feels almost unrecognizable compared to where they started. The emotional overwhelm that once controlled them has turned into emotional awareness. The patterns that once drained them have turned into lessons that guide them. The sensitivity that once felt like a burden has become one of their greatest strengths. And perhaps the most powerful part of all is that they didn't lose their ability to feel deeply. They simply learned how to protect it, how to direct it, and how to use it in a way that serves them instead of harming them. This is what makes their power so different, and why it often comes later in life. Because it is not built on surface-level traits or temporary confidence. It is built on experience, on growth, on the ability to turn pain into understanding and understanding into strength. It is a kind of power that cannot be rushed, cannot be taught quickly, and cannot be taken away once it is fully developed. It is earned through every moment they thought they were falling behind, every time they felt too sensitive, every experience that forced them to grow in ways they didn't expect. And when they finally reach this stage, they begin to see their journey not as something that held them back, but as something that set them apart. Because while others may have learned how to navigate the surface of life, they have learned how to navigate its depth. They have learned how to read between words, how to understand emotions without explanation, how to remain grounded in situations that once would have overwhelmed them. And this depth becomes their advantage in ways that extend into every area of their life, relationships, decisions, purpose, and self-understanding. And the most beautiful part is that they no longer question whether they are too much or not enough. They no longer try to change themselves to fit into spaces that don't recognize their value. Instead, they stand firmly in who they are, knowing that the right people, the right environments, and the right opportunities will naturally align with them. Not because they are chasing them, but because they have become the kind of person who attracts what is meant for them. And in that space, there is no rush, no desperation, no need to prove anything. There is only clarity, peace, and a quiet, undeniable strength that continues to grow with time. And from this place of clarity, something even more profound begins to take shape. Something that goes beyond healing, beyond understanding, beyond simply protecting their peace. It becomes a way of living that is deeply intentional. They no longer move through life reacting to everything around them. Instead, they move with awareness, with choice, with a quiet sense of control over where their energy flows. What once felt chaotic now feels filtered. What once felt overwhelming now feels manageable. And perhaps the most powerful shift of all is this: they are no longer absorbing everything, they are deciding what deserves to reach them. This change is subtle on the outside, but internally it is life-altering. Because for someone who once felt at the mercy of every emotion in the room, learning to choose what to carry is nothing short of transformation. With this control comes a deeper sense of emotional independence. They are no longer dependent on others to feel stable, valued, or understood. They have built something within themselves that doesn't collapse when external situations change. This doesn't mean they stop caring or connecting. It means their sense of self is no longer tied to how others treat them. If someone appreciates them, it adds to their life, but it doesn't define it. If someone misunderstands them, it no longer shakes their identity. They have reached a point where they can stand in their truth without needing constant agreement or validation. And this kind of independence is rare because it requires letting go of the need to be accepted by everyone, which was once one of their deepest desires. As they continue to move through life with this new awareness, their intuition becomes sharper than ever. It's no longer just a feeling, it's a guiding force they trust without hesitation. They can sense misalignment early before it turns into something draining. They can recognize when something feels right, even if it doesn't make logical sense yet. And instead of ignoring these signals like they once did, they follow them. This trust in themselves creates a sense of inner security that no external situation can easily disrupt. Because even when things are uncertain, they know they can rely on their own perception to guide them through. And this trust begins to influence the way they approach opportunities, decisions, and even challenges. They are no longer rushing into things out of fear of missing out or staying out of fear of being alone. Every choice becomes more intentional. They ask themselves not just what looks good on the surface, but what feels aligned at a deeper level. And this alignment becomes their compass. It leads them away from situations that once would have drained them and toward experiences that nourish them instead. It reshapes their life in ways that may not be immediately visible to others, but are deeply felt by them. There is also a noticeable shift in how they handle conflict. In the past, conflict may have felt overwhelming, something to avoid at all costs or something that left them emotionally exhausted for days. But now, they approach it differently. They don't fear it in the same way, because they are no longer afraid of losing themselves within it. They can express their thoughts without losing control of their emotions. They can listen without immediately absorbing everything. They can walk away when necessary without carrying guilt. This doesn't mean conflict disappears from their life. It means it no longer has the power to destabilize them the way it once did. And as this emotional stability grows, so does their ability to influence the environment around them, not through force or control, but through presence. There is something about someone who is deeply grounded that naturally shifts the energy of a room. Their calmness becomes contagious. Their clarity creates space for honesty. Their ability to listen without judgment makes others feel safe in a way they may not have experienced before. And without even trying, they become a source of balance for those around them. But this time there is a difference. They are no longer giving endlessly without awareness. They are sharing from a place of fullness, not from a place of depletion. At this stage, they also begin to understand the importance of protecting their peace at a higher level. Not just through boundaries with people, but through the choices they make daily. What they consume, what they focus on, what they allow into their mental and emotional space, it all becomes intentional. They recognize that their sensitivity is still very much a part of who they are, but now it is refined, directed, and protected. They are no longer careless with their energy because they understand its value. And this awareness shapes a lifestyle that supports their well-being rather than constantly challenging it. And then something remarkable happens. They begin to see their past self with a sense of gratitude rather than pain. The version of them that once felt overwhelmed, confused, and out of place, they no longer see that version as weak. They see it as necessary. Because without that version, they would not have developed the depth, the awareness, and the strength they carry now. Every moment of struggle, every time they felt like they didn't belong, every experience that forced them to grow, it all contributed to who they have become. And this realization brings a sense of closure that doesn't require forgetting the past, but rather understanding it. This is also where their sense of purpose begins to evolve. Not necessarily in a grand or dramatic way, but in a quiet understanding of how they move through the world. They realize that their ability to feel deeply, to understand others, to see beyond the surface, it has value. Not in a way that requires them to sacrifice themselves, but in a way that allows them to contribute meaningfully without losing their balance. They may find themselves drawn to environments, conversations, or paths where this depth is appreciated rather than exploited. And this alignment between who they are and how they live creates a sense of fulfillment that was once missing. There is no longer a feeling of being behind in life, no longer a sense that they are late to something everyone else figured out earlier, because they now understand that their journey was never meant to follow the same timeline. Their growth required depth, and depth takes time. What they have built within themselves cannot be rushed, replicated, or easily shaken. And this understanding replaces comparison with confidence. They are exactly where they need to be, not because everything is perfect, but because they are aligned with their own path. And as they continue forward, their power becomes something that is not always visible, but always present. It is in the way they choose peace over chaos. It is in the way they walk away from what no longer serves them without hesitation. It is in the way they trust themselves even when others don't understand. It is in the way they remain grounded in situations that once would have overwhelmed them. This power does not demand attention, but it commands respect. It is not loud, but it is undeniable. And perhaps the most important transformation of all is this: they are no longer trying to become someone else. They are no longer chasing a version of themselves that fits into someone else's expectations. They have returned to who they were always meant to be, but this time with awareness, with strength, and with the ability to protect that identity. They are no longer at the mercy of their sensitivity, they are in control of it. This is what it means for their power to emerge later in life. It is not delayed, it is developed. It is not missing, it is maturing. And by the time it fully arrives, it carries a depth and stability that cannot be easily shaken. It is the kind of power that comes from knowing yourself completely, from understanding the world around you deeply, and from choosing how you engage with both. And in that space, they are no longer just someone who feels everything. They are someone who understands what to do with what they feel.